Chapter 1. The Visit I Was Never Supposed to Make. The night I realized my husband had been stealing our money to support a secret family did not begin with suspicion. It began with a lie he repeated for almost a year, that his mother was dying and needed expensive treatments. So while I worked longer hours and transferred thousands of dollars to help save her life, he was quietly using that money to pay rent for another home and another woman 30 minutes away. And I would have believed him forever if I had not walked into my own son's birthday party and discovered the truth everyone else already knew. But what he did not expect was that every transfer, every lease payment, and every lie he told created a financial trail that my lawyer would later place in front of a judge during our divorce hearing. And by the time the court finished reviewing the evidence, the money he thought he had stolen forever was legally returned to me. So if you have ever wondered what happens when the quiet wife everyone underestimates finally stops believing the story she is being told, my name is Emily Carter, and this is the night my husband learned that the truth costs a lot more than lies. I never planned to drive across Columbus that evening. For most of the past year, my life had followed a quiet routine that felt almost mechanical. I worked long shifts at Lakeshore Recovery Clinic on the east side of the city, picked up my 6-year-old son Owen from first grade, made dinner, helped him with spelling homework, and tried to believe that everything inside my marriage was still stable. My husband Mark always told me things were under control. His mother, Patricia Hayes, had been sick for almost a year, and nearly every evening he drove Owen across town to visit her. I rarely went with them. Mark always had a reason. Some nights he said Patricia was sleeping and did not want visitors. Other nights he told me she was embarrassed about how weak she looked. Eventually, I stopped asking. I trusted him. That was what I thought a supportive wife was supposed to do. The story of Patricia's illness began the previous spring. One week, Mark said it was a lung infection. The next week, it was immune complications. Sometimes he mentioned specialists in Cleveland who required tests that insurance would not cover. I worked in medical billing, so complicated hospital charges were part of my everyday life. When Mark explained the costs, I believed him without hesitation. Over 11 months, I transferred almost $15,000 to help with medication, imaging tests, and consultations. I told myself I was helping family. The first crack appeared during an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at work. I was reviewing insurance claims at my desk when my phone buzzed with a bank notification. A transfer had left our joint account earlier that morning. $940. The description read Lakeview Property Services. I stared at the words longer than I expected. It did not sound like a medical office. It sounded like a leasing company. I locked my phone and told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Still, the details stayed in my mind for the rest of the afternoon. 2 days later, something else happened. I picked Owen up from school like usual. He climbed into the back seat and started talking immediately. "Mom, Biscuit learned a new trick today." I looked at him through the rearview mirror. "Who is Biscuit?" "The dog," he said. "What dog?" "Emma dog, at Grandma Patricia house." The name meant nothing to me. "Who is Emma?" "Emma Carter," he said casually. "Dad friend. She helps Grandma when Grandma's sick." The answer made something in my chest tighten, even though I kept my voice calm. That night, after dinner, I called Mark while he was finishing work. "Hey," I said, "Owen mentioned someone named Emma Carter." There was a brief silence before he responded. "Oh yeah, she lives down the street from Mom, just helps out sometimes." "A neighbor?" "Something like that," he said. Then his tone shifted slightly. "You really need to stop looking for problems that are not there. Mom is sick. That should be the only thing that matters." The conversation ended a minute later. Still, the uneasiness stayed with me. Over the next week, more small details appeared, each one easy to ignore by itself, but harder to dismiss when placed together. One afternoon, I cleaned Mark's truck while Owen rode his bike in the driveway. When I opened the center console, a receipt slid out. A restaurant in downtown Cleveland, dinner for two, $187. When I asked Mark about it later, he barely looked up from his phone. "Client dinner," he said. "It was Saturday night," I replied. "Clients work weekends too," he said calmly. That was the end of the conversation. A few days later, I borrowed the truck to run errands. As soon as I opened the passenger door, I noticed a faint scent hanging in the air. Vanilla perfume. Sweet and unfamiliar. Not mine. When I mentioned it later that evening, Mark laughed. "You're imagining things again," he said. "You always do this when you get stressed." The comment made me feel foolish for bringing it up. Still, something inside me refused to settle. The bank transfers continued, too. Another payment appeared the following week, $800, again labeled Lakeview Property Services. That night, after Owen went to bed, I logged into our bank account and scrolled through older transactions. There were more, several of them. When I added them together, the total had already passed $5,000. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the screen, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Then Owen wandered into the room in his pajamas. "Mom, Emma said Biscuit might come to my birthday party." I blinked at him. "Your birthday is next week," I said. "I know," he replied happily. "Emma said we might have cake at Grandma Patricia's house." I forced a smile, even though something deep inside me felt wrong, because I had already planned to bake his birthday cake myself that weekend. 2 days later, the moment arrived that changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon. Mark walked into the kitchen while I was unpacking groceries. "Mom's not doing great today," he said while grabbing his keys. "I'm taking Owen over there." I turned toward him. "I could come too." He immediately shook his head. "She's not up for visitors." I hesitated. "At least let me bring soup." "I'll take it," he said. He lifted Owen into his arms and headed towards the door. Owen waved cheerfully. "Bye, Mom. See you later." The door closed behind them. For a few seconds, I stood alone in the quiet kitchen. Then I packed the soup into a container, grabbed my purse, and walked outside. If Patricia was truly that sick, she deserved more than secondhand support. And if something else was happening, I needed to see it myself. The drive across Columbus took about 30 minutes. When I turned onto Maple Grove Lane, something strange caught my attention immediately. Cars lined both sides of the street. Too many cars for a quiet neighborhood. I parked halfway down the block and walked towards Patricia's house. Even before I reached the porch, I could hear music drifting through the windows. Children laughing, someone clapping. For a moment, I wondered if the noise was coming from a neighbor house. Then I smelled something sweet in the air. Birthday cake. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly. Bright lights filled the living room. Balloons floated near the ceiling. A banner stretched across the wall. A decorated cake sat on the dining table. In the center of the room sat my son, Owen. He was sitting on the lap of a young woman I had never seen before. She held him gently while everyone counted down. 3, 2, 1. "Lean forward, sweetheart," she said softly. Owen leaned forward and blew out the candles. The room burst into applause. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hand still on the door handle. Because in that moment, I understood exactly what I was looking at. It was my son's birthday party, and somehow I was the only person in the room who had not been invited. Chapter 2. The Husband I Thought I Knew. For a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. The music that had been playing in the background faded into an awkward silence, and every adult in the living room slowly turned to look at me standing in the doorway. Someone near the kitchen counter quietly lowered the volume on a small speaker. Children stopped reaching for cake. I could feel the weight of 20 confused eyes resting on me. Mark was the first person to react. His hands dropped from their clapping position and his smile vanished almost instantly. It was the kind of expression that appears when someone realizes a secret has just walked into the room unannounced. Emma Carter was still sitting in the chair at the center of the living room, with Owen perched happily on her lap. She looked younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with long brown hair and the relaxed confidence of someone who believed she belonged there. When she noticed me, her expression shifted from comfortable to uncertain. But she did not stand up. Instead, she kept one hand resting gently on Owen's shoulder, as if she had done it many times before. That detail made my chest tighten. Owen saw me next. "Mom!" he shouted. His voice broke the silence instantly. He jumped down from Emma's lap and ran across the room toward me, weaving past balloons and chairs. I caught him automatically, wrapping my arms around him before my mind had time to process the rest of the scene. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I whispered. He grinned up at me. "Did you see my cake, Mom?" I looked past him toward the dining table. Blue frosting, 6 candles, a banner stretched across the wall with bright letters spelling his name. "Happy birthday, Owen." My stomach twisted. It looked like a party planned carefully by people who knew exactly what they were celebrating. Owen pulled on my sleeve excitedly. "Emma helped pick the decorations," he said. "She said blue is my favorite color." My eyes moved slowly back toward the woman sitting in the chair. Emma gave a small, polite smile. "Hi," she said softly. The sound of her voice felt strange in that room. Mark finally stepped toward me. "What are you doing here, Emily?" he asked quietly. The way he said my name sounded more like a warning than a question. I held the soup container in my hand like I had forgotten it was there. "You told me your mother was having a bad day." Mark glanced quickly across the room toward the kitchen. His mother, Patricia Hayes, stood near the counter, holding a stack of plates. She looked completely healthy. Her posture was straight and relaxed, her cheeks pink from the warmth of the house. She did not look like someone who had been battling a serious illness for almost a year. Patricia set the plates down slowly and walked closer. "Emily," she said calmly, "we assumed you were working today." Her tone carried that same polite distance I had heard for years. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. "It is not what it looks like." The phrase echoed in my head, because in that moment something inside me began connecting pieces that had never made sense before. Everyone in that room seemed uncomfortable, except Emma. She stood up now and walked over to Owen, gently wiping frosting from his chin with a napkin. "You got icing everywhere," she said with a soft laugh. Owen giggled. "Sorry." She smiled at him. "It's okay, sweetheart." The word sweetheart landed in the room like a stone dropped into water. Something about the ease between them made my chest tighten again. Mark cleared his throat. "Emily, maybe we should talk in the kitchen." I looked at him for a long second. Then I nodded. As we stepped away from the living room, the noise of children talking slowly returned behind us, but the awkward tension stayed wrapped around the adults like a heavy blanket. That moment in the doorway stayed with me for a long time afterward. But the truth was, the warning signs existed long before I walked into Patricia Hayes' living room that night. I just did not recognize them then. I met Mark 8 years earlier at a summer block party in our old neighborhood outside Cleveland. It was one of those warm evenings when everyone brought folding chairs into their driveways and the street smelled like grilled burgers and fresh lemonade. Mark stood out because he listened more than he talked. He worked as a loan officer at Lakeview Community Credit Union and spent most of the evening helping people understand mortgage paperwork. People trusted him immediately. He had a calm way of explaining complicated things that made everyone feel reassured. By the end of the night, 3 different neighbors were thanking him for explaining interest rates. When he finally walked over to where I stood near the grill, he smiled. "You're the only person here who hasn't asked me about money," he said. I laughed. "Maybe I just like watching people solve problems." That conversation turned into a long walk around the block. 2 years later, we were married in a small church near downtown Cleveland. The early years of our marriage felt stable and predictable. We bought a modest house. I began working at Lakeshore Recovery Clinic handling insurance billing. Mark continued helping people secure home loans. Our weekends were simple: grocery shopping, movie nights, occasional drives along Lake Erie. Then Owen was born. The day he arrived at University Medical Center was the happiest day of my life. The first visitor after the nurses settled us into the recovery room was Mark's mother, Patricia Hayes. She stood near the hospital bed holding a bouquet of white lilies. "Congratulations," she said. Her tone was polite but distant. She looked down at Owen, sleeping in the bassinet. "He looks like Mark." I waited for warmth in her voice. It never came. Over the next few years, Patricia rarely criticized me directly, but her comments always carried subtle edges. During dinner, one evening, she studied me carefully across the table. "You're very practical, Emily," she said. "Mark has always preferred practical women." Another afternoon, she watched me helping Owen stack toy blocks in the living room. "Ambition changes after motherhood," she said calmly. "Sometimes that's for the best." I ignored the remarks. Raising Owen mattered more than arguing with his grandmother. For several years, things remained manageable. Then, one evening, late the previous spring, Mark came home looking worried. "Mom's not doing well," he said. I remember standing at the kitchen sink with soap still on my hands. "What happened?" I asked. He sighed. "The doctors think it might be a lung condition." That was the beginning. Over the following months, the explanation changed slightly each time he mentioned it. Some weeks it was respiratory problems, some weeks autoimmune complications. Sometimes there were new specialists who required expensive tests. "Insurance doesn't cover everything," he said one evening while reviewing bills at the kitchen table. "I understand medical billing," I told him gently. "I know how confusing those charges can be." That's when the money transfers began. $200, $500, then larger amounts. One night I asked quietly, "Do you want me to go with you when you visit your mom next time?" Mark shook his head immediately. "She doesn't want anyone seeing her like this." Another time I suggested bringing groceries. He frowned. "She would hate feeling like a burden." Every explanation sounded reasonable. Every conversation ended with the same quiet pressure. "You always overthink things, Emily," he said more than once. "You imagine problems that aren't there." At the time, I believed him, because I thought trusting my husband was the same thing as protecting my family. Looking back now, I can see how those months slowly changed him. Mark stayed out later, he drove across town more often, and every time I asked a question, he made me feel like I was the one doing something wrong. I stopped asking questions. I worked longer hours. I transferred money when he said medical bills were due, and I trusted the man I had married. Long enough for him to build a life that did not include me. Chapter 3. The Things That Never Added Up. At first, I tried to believe the strange moments in my life were unrelated. A confusing bill here, an odd comment there, a small, uneasy feeling that I kept pushing aside because the alternative felt too heavy to carry. But by the beginning of that year, the details began lining up in ways I could no longer ignore. The first real warning appeared on a quiet Sunday morning. Owen was sitting on the living room carpet building a tall tower of plastic blocks while a cartoon played softly on the television. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, paying the usual stack of bills. Mortgage, utilities, credit card. Then one payment stopped me. $780. The description read, Riverstone Residential Management. I frowned and clicked on the transaction. 3 days earlier. I scrolled upward through the statement. Another payment, $920. Then another, $850. My chest tightened as I opened the previous month. More payments, different amounts, same company. When I added them together, the total crossed $6,000. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I stared at the screen. Owen looked up from his block tower. "Mom, look," he said proudly. The tower wobbled and then collapsed across the carpet. I forced a smile. "That one was almost taller than you." He laughed and began stacking the pieces again. The ordinary moment felt strange against the quiet tension building in my chest. That evening, Mark came home late. Owen had already fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled over his shoulders. Mark walked in, loosened his tie, and dropped his keys on the kitchen counter. "Long day," he muttered. I closed the laptop and turned toward him. "What is Riverstone Residential Management?" He paused for half a second. "What about it?" "There are payments from our account, several of them, almost $6,000. He walked to the refrigerator and opened it, like the conversation bored him. "That is temporary housing," he said. "For who?" "For my mom, physical therapist." I blinked. Her therapist lives in an apartment paid by us? He shrugged. She needed to stay nearby during treatment. The answer came too easily. Something about it felt rehearsed. I leaned against the counter. "Why did you not tell me?" Mark sighed heavily and closed the refrigerator door. "Emily, you were doing that thing again." "Doing what?" "Looking for problems that are not there." He rubbed his forehead. "My mother is sick, and I am trying to handle everything." The way he said it made me feel guilty for asking. I lowered my voice. "I just wanted to understand." He shook his head. "Not everything needs to be a mystery." The conversation ended there, but the doubt stayed. A few weeks later, I met my friend Natalie Carter for coffee after work. Natalie had been my closest friend since college, and now worked as a paralegal at a family law office downtown, the kind of place where people brought their marriages when they were already falling apart. The cafe was crowded and loud, but Natalie seemed distracted. She stirred her coffee slowly before speaking. "Emily, I need to ask you something." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" "I saw Mark last month." "Where?" "Downtown." She hesitated before finishing the sentence. "He was having dinner with a woman." The words hit harder than I expected. "You probably saw someone else," I said quickly. Natalie shook her head gently. "No, I know what your husband looks like." My fingers tightened around my coffee cup. "Maybe it was a client." She hesitated again. "Emily, they were holding hands." The cafe noise faded for a moment. I forced a small laugh. "Mark has been dealing with his mom's illness for months. He barely sleeps." Natalie watched me carefully. "I'm not trying to start problems," she said quietly. "I just thought you should know." I nodded, even though my chest felt tight. "Thanks." She leaned back in her chair. Sometimes the person we trust the most is the one we question the least. Her words stayed with me long after we left the cafe. Still, I convinced myself she was wrong, because believing anything else meant accepting something I was not ready to face. The final piece appeared 1 week before Owen's birthday. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, reviewing our bank account. Another Riverstone payment had gone through, $890. This time, there was a small document icon attached to the transaction. Curiosity made me click it. The file opened slowly. A lease agreement appeared on my screen. My heartbeat began to climb as I scanned the page. Apartment address across town, monthly rent, start date. 10 months earlier. My eyes moved lower on the page. Tenant name, Mark Sullivan. I stared at the screen. 10 months? The apartment existed long before the medical bills ever started. My hands began to shake slightly on the keyboard. 10 months of payments. 10 months of explanations. 10 months of me believing every word he said. Soft footsteps padded into the room. I quickly minimized the document. Owen walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Mom?" I turned toward him. "Hey, sweetheart." He leaned against the table. "Emma said Biscuit might come to my birthday party." My chest tightened. "Emma? Where did you see Emma?" I asked gently. "At Grandma's house," he said. "She comes over a lot." He smiled sleepily. "She helps Dad sometimes." The room felt very quiet. I nodded slowly. "That sounds nice." Owen yawned. "Can we have pancakes tomorrow?" "Of course." He smiled and walked back toward the hallway. I sat at the kitchen table long after he went back to bed. The lease document glowed on the laptop screen when I opened it again. 10 months, an apartment across town, money from our account, a woman my son already knew. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. The strange moments in my life were no longer random. They were pieces of a story. And for the first time, I was beginning to understand what that story might actually mean. Chapter 4. The Birthday I Was Never Meant to See. The truth stepped into the room with me the moment the door opened. For a second, nobody moved. The music had stopped. The laughter that had filled the house only seconds earlier had completely disappeared. The entire living room froze like someone had pressed pause on a scene that was never meant to include me. Every adult in the room turned to stare. Mark stood near the kitchen doorway. The color drained from his face the moment he saw me. "Emily, what are you doing here?" he said. His voice was quiet but sharp, like he was trying to keep the situation from exploding in front of everyone. I did not answer him right away. My attention had already shifted to the woman standing beside the birthday cake. She looked comfortable in that room, comfortable in a way that suggested she had been there many times before. Owen noticed me next. "Owen!" he shouted happily. Before anyone could react, he jumped down from his chair and ran across the room, his arms wrapped around my waist with the same excited energy he always had. I hugged him automatically. "Did you see my cake?" he asked. I glanced at the table. Blue frosting, dinosaur candles, a banner taped across the wall with his name written in bright letters. "Happy birthday, Owen." It was the kind of party a family plans together. It was also a party that had happened without me. "It looks amazing, sweetheart," I said quietly. Owen smiled and pointed behind him. "Shelby helped pick it out." My eyes lifted slowly. Shelby. The woman near the cake gave a small, polite smile. "Hi, Emily," she said. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who did not feel like an outsider. Mark stepped closer to me. "Emily, maybe we should talk in the kitchen." I ignored him. Instead, I looked past him toward the back of the room. His mother stood near the counter, holding a stack of paper plates. Elaine Sullivan looked perfectly healthy. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes clear, her voice steady. There was no sign of the illness that had supposedly been destroying her body for nearly a year. She placed the plates on the table carefully. "You were not supposed to come tonight," she said. The sentence hung in the air. For a moment, nobody in the room breathed. I stared at her. "You told Mark you were dying." Elaine did not respond immediately. Mark stepped forward quickly. "Emily, please do not start this here." "Start what?" I asked. "Making a scene," he said under his breath. I laughed softly, a short, quiet sound that surprised even me. "You threw a birthday party for my son and did not invite his mother?" I gestured around the room. "And you think I am the one making a scene?" The relatives along the walls shifted awkwardly. One woman near the couch suddenly focused on adjusting a stack of napkins that did not need adjusting. A man near the doorway looked down at his phone even though the screen was dark. Nobody looked shocked. Nobody looked confused. That was when the worst realization arrived. They all knew. Every person in this room had already accepted the situation. I was the only one who had not been informed. Owen tugged on my hand. "Mom, are you mad?" His small voice cut through the tension like a knife. I knelt down so we were eye level. "Of course not." He smiled. "Shelby helped me pick the candles," he said. Shelby knelt beside him immediately. "You picked them," she said warmly. "You said dinosaurs were the best." She brushed frosting off his cheek with a napkin. "There we go, sweetheart." The word landed heavily in my chest. Sweetheart. The casual affection in her voice told me more than anything else in the room. I stood slowly. "How long have you known my son?" I asked. Shelby looked toward Mark. Mark answered instead. "Emily, stop interrogating people." I turned to him. "That is what you said every time I asked a question this year. Every time something did not make sense, you told me I was overthinking." Mark rubbed his forehead. "This is not the place for this conversation." "You are right," I said quietly. I looked back at Elaine. "You look very healthy for someone who has been dying for 11 months. Her lips pressed together. "Family matters are not your concern tonight," she said calmly. The sentence made something inside me snap into clarity. Family matters. I looked slowly around the living room. The decorations, the comfortable way Shelby moved around the house, the way Owen already knew her name. This was not a new situation. This was something that had been happening for months. The party had not been thrown suddenly. It had been planned. Shelby leaned closer to Owen again. "Are you ready to open presents?" she asked him. "Yes!" He pointed to the pile of boxes near the couch. "Those ones are mine." Shelby laughed softly. "I think you might be right." Mark stepped closer again. "Emily, please, let us step outside." His voice was quieter now, controlled. He wanted distance from the witnesses. I held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, away from the people who had silently watched this entire story unfold. I nodded once. "Fine." Mark exhaled slowly. As we walked toward the front door, I looked back over my shoulder one last time. Shelby was kneeling beside Owen, helping him stack the presents. Elaine was calmly slicing the cake. The relatives had already begun talking again. The party was restarting, almost as if my presence had been a brief inconvenience. That was when the final piece settled into place inside my mind. This was not just an affair. This was an entirely separate life, and everyone in that room had been helping Mark keep it hidden from me. Chapter 5. The Truth They Thought I Would Never Discover. The night air outside the house felt colder than I expected. Mark closed the door behind us, cutting off the sound of the birthday party that had already started, continuing without me. Laughter drifted faintly through the walls, Owen's voice rising above the others for a moment before fading again. For a second, we both stood there on the porch. Then Mark spoke. "Emily, listen to me." I crossed my arms. "I have been listening to you for almost a year." He ran a hand through his hair, the same nervous habit he always had when something slipped out of his control. "It is not what you think," he said. I let out a quiet breath. "You said that earlier tonight." "Then explain it." Mark looked toward the street instead of meeting my eyes. "Shelby has been helping me during a difficult time." "Helping you do what?" He hesitated. "Figure out what I want my life to look like." The honesty of the sentence almost made me laugh. "So, the illness was fake," I said. He shifted his weight uncomfortably. "My mother exaggerated things." "You told me she was dying." He stayed silent. Behind the door, we could hear children shouting happily as presents were being opened. The sound made something inside my chest tighten. I looked back at him. All the hospital bills, the late nights, the apartment across town. You expected me to believe all of that? Mark rubbed his forehead. "Emily, I never meant for things to get this complicated." "It was already complicated," I said quietly. You just hoped I would never notice." For the first time, his voice grew impatient. "You always assume the worst." I stared at him. "No, I assumed the best. That was the problem." Mark did not respond. Instead, he looked tired, defensive, cornered. "Emily, please," he said. "Let us not destroy everything over one mistake." I felt something settle calmly inside my chest. This was not one mistake. This was a second life. The words came out quietly but clearly. Mark opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. For a moment, he seemed to understand that nothing he said would repair what had already broken. I took a slow breath. "We are done." His head snapped up. "Emily, do not do something dramatic." I shook my head. "The dramatic thing already happened. You just thought I would never see it." Then I walked past him down the driveway and got into my car. The drive home was strangely peaceful. For months, my thoughts had been tangled in confusion. Now, everything felt clear. 2 days later, I met my friend Natalie Carter for lunch. She listened carefully as I described the birthday party. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "I'm sorry you had to see it like that." "In a strange way, I'm glad I did," I said. "Why?" "Because if I had not walked through that door, I might still be believing his stories." Natalie nodded slowly. "What are you going to do now?" "I already know." Later that week, she introduced me to a family law attorney named Daniel Brooks. His office overlooked a quiet street downtown. The walls were lined with shelves full of legal files that represented marriages that had quietly fallen apart. Daniel reviewed the documents I brought: bank statements, transfer records, the lease agreement. After several minutes, he leaned back in his chair. "Your husband left a very clear financial trail," he said. "What does that mean for me?" "It means he used marital funds to support another household." He tapped the stack of papers. "Courts take that seriously." For the first time since the party, I felt something unexpected: relief. The legal process moved slowly over the following months. Mark tried to minimize what had happened. He described the apartment as temporary housing. He described Shelby as someone who helped him through stress. But the financial records told a different story: payments for rent, furniture purchases, utility bills, money taken directly from the account we shared. One afternoon, during a meeting, Daniel slid another document across the desk. Mark had already realized the evidence against him was stronger than he expected. His attorney had proposed a settlement. I read the numbers carefully: the apartment expenses, the hidden transfers, nearly $20,000. Money I believed was paying for hospital treatments. Instead, it had funded a secret life. Daniel folded his hands calmly. "You have a strong position here." A few months later, we sat quietly in a courtroom as the final terms were approved. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, just legal consequences written on paper. Mark signed the documents with tight shoulders. For the first time since I had known him, he looked unsure of himself. The life he had carefully arranged collided with reality. When everything was finished, he avoided my eyes as we left the room. Outside the courthouse, he finally spoke. "I never thought things would end like this." I looked at him. "That's because you never expected me to stop believing you." He had no answer. Life after the divorce settled into a different rhythm. Owen and I moved into a smaller house closer to his school. The mornings became quieter, the evenings calmer. Healing did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, one peaceful day at a time. Months later, Owen asked me a question while we were eating dinner. "Mom, are you happier now?" I thought about it for a moment. "Yes," I said. "I think I am." He nodded and returned to his food as if the answer made perfect sense. Children understand more than we realize. Looking back now, I understand something important about that night on the porch. Revenge did not arrive the way I once imagined. It was not loud. It was not cruel. It was simply the moment I stopped protecting someone else's lies. Mark believed he controlled the story of our marriage. He believed I would keep trusting his explanations. But the moment I walked through that door and saw the truth, everything changed. The lies stopped working. And sometimes that's the strongest revenge there is, simply refusing to believe the version of reality someone else tries to force you to accept. If you've ever been told that you are imagining things, if someone has tried to make you doubt your own instincts, listen carefully to that quiet voice inside you, because the people who work hardest to silence your questions are often the ones hiding the biggest truths. And if a story like this feels familiar in your own life, you're not alone. Share your thoughts and experiences below, and stay with this channel if you want to hear more stories about people who found strength after betrayal. Sometimes the truth becomes easier to face when we realize others have walked the same path. If you value stories where strength is quiet but unshakable, subscribe.